Mexico actually may try to put the El Paso shooter on trial. Let me explain. Mexican Foreign Minister Marcelo Ebrard said Monday his country may seek to extradite the alleged shooter on terrorism charges. Now, investigators, of course, you know this, believe the shooter is the author of an online manifesto that rallied against what he called a Hispanic invasion, in Texas. And Minister Ebrard says Mexico has the grounds to do this, to charge him in Mexico because the shooting qualifies as an act of terrorism under Mexican law, saying we consider this to be an act of terrorism carried out on United States soil, but terrorism against Mexicans. Now, Mexican officials also want to be involved in the US's investigation, saying we are worried that other people think the same way as this suspect. We want to participate in the investigation via the FGR, and that's Mexico's Attorney General's office, to be able to understand if this man had ties to other people and if he wrote the manifesto. We will raise all of this with US authorities. Now, of course, you may know the US and Mexico have had this kind of long bilateral extradition arrangement, and that's how El Chapo was able to be extradited to the US and prosecuted here in the United States, in New York, actually, for his crimes. Interestingly enough, though, Mexico has never extradited someone from the US to stand trial in Mexico. Meanwhile, though, Mexico frequently takes legal action to advocate for its citizens abroad. Mexico has historically opposed the death penalty, and it has provided legal resources to Mexican nationals facing capital punishment in the United States. It even took the United States to the International Court of Justice in 2003 and won on grounds that the United States had violated the rights of Mexican citizens it had condemned to death. Now, legal experts say extradition likely won't happen because, of course, the shooter is facing charges in El Paso, and the feds are actually, I think, investigating him for domestic terrorism. And international law also prohibits two countries from trying a suspect for the same crime. And given Mexico's obvious aversion to the death penalty, the alleged gunman, if found guilty, would actually pay a steeper price in the United States. So this is highly symbolic.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's partly, the Obrador saying, hey, look, I'm gonna fight back. A lot of people in Mexico are obviously super mad. And actually, even though he's considered very left, he has actually not taken on Trump much at all until now. And so I think people are a little bit at a breaking point. But I think they made a really great point there, and it gets to a larger one. They said, look, how do we know this is the only guy? So we're worried about this network. And I was reading online recently that it's actually a great point. They keep calling it domestic terrorism, but there is now a network of radical white supremacists all across the world. The guy who did the shooting in New Zealand, obviously Breivik in Norway that killed all those people, and they are being encouraged by one another. The New Zealand white supremacist shooter was encouraged by, I think, the guy who did the Pittsburgh synagogue shooting, and then this guy who wrote the manifesto and did the shooting in El Paso said he was encouraged by the New Zealand guy. So I think the Mexican government is very right to say, first of all, 8 of our citizens were killed. If 8 Americans were killed anywhere, we would want to extradite, and we would be very concerned about that. We would want all recourse and our rights exercised there to protect American citizens. And then secondly, they say, how do we know it's over? I don't think it's over, and I don't think it's what you think it is, calling it domestic terrorism. It isn't. This is a group of white supremacists, radicals all across the globe. And so we have a stake in stopping this, especially because they're targeting us specifically.
Well, this is the type of language you would like to hear from leaders in the United States, especially the president, but it seems like everyone else is actually very concerned about the repercussions of these acts of terror which continue to happen, and these individuals are becoming radicalized, not on their own, but as parts of groups. As you said, they're sharing each other's manifestos, they're complementing each other in each of these attacks. And what you should be expecting from leaders in the country is to be putting resources towards trying to find out where these groups are hiding out online and try to research a little bit more thoroughly, but Donald Trump actually cut funds from doing so. The FBI notoriously, a couple of years ago, when questioned, Jeff Sessions especially was asked, are you looking into any white identity extremists? Because they were talking about looking into black identity extremists, which no one knew was a thing, and no one was actually understanding whether or not that was a threat. But Jeff Sessions was able to say it was, and then when asked about white identity extremists, he blanked. And the woman had to be like, oh, KKK, any of these ringing a bell? So I think what you need to think about in terms of the United States is, why is these countries elsewhere so adamant in trying to highlight the dangers? I mean, you've got people saying they don't want their own citizens traveling to the United States because of the threat that these people are posing. But it's instead inside this country, you've got leaders trying to jump through hoops to downplay the threat of such terror in its growing magnitude. It just seems to me this is more symbolic than anything else, because I don't think Mexico are actually going to be able to do anything, and I don't think they will. But it just shows, why is everyone else so adamant to condemn this threat and bring it to a larger scale, but the US isn't?
Yeah, so I do want to say I think there is one part that might be actionable and not just symbolic. So, bringing us to the International Court of Human Rights, we don't even recognize it. We're like, human rights, what name so? No, John Bolton's like, I can't wait to dismiss that out of hand. He hates any mention of international courts or human rights. We're obviously not going to extradite the guy. He killed so many citizens here. Texas is very likely to pursue the death penalty. So I get that, but I get them asking for it, and they should. If it was us, we would ask for it. But they're also threatening to sue the gun manufacturers. Now, here in America, the corruption is so bad that we're blocking people from suing gun manufacturers. The politicians don't do anything about the massacres, but they literally have passed bills to protect the guys making the weapons. I know it seems unbelievable, especially if you're outside the country. Yes, the only thing that US politicians protect is the actual gun manufacturers. But if that doesn't stop a foreign country from suing them. So if a foreign country says, hey, you killed 8 of my citizens, I'm gonna sue you, I'm gonna take you to court, that could be a really interesting court case.
No, I think this is interesting, and I do think you made a really good point that if this were something happening in other countries, people were in Australia and deciding they were going to go to a shopping center and kill everyone who is American, we would be up in arms. This country, absolutely, it would be a way bigger deal than I think we're even making it here in this country. And the problem is we can't take it seriously, because part of that is you'd have to acknowledge that you went through this list of kind of this circle of who this person was radicalized by this person who was radicalized by this person and this person, when they all are heavily influenced by the person who's leading this country.
Yeah, well, that's true. But and also on another note, which I forgot to mention before, is if Mexico did pursue this in the form of calling it what it is, terrorism, then that's something as AOC highlighted so eloquently on the floor when she basically called out how these acts of terror, if they happen to be perpetrated by black or brown folk, such as the Orlando shooting, they had no problem calling that an act of terror, but then Dylan Roof wasn't considered an act of terror. So if in doing so, what you're going to do is you're going to actually maybe, and Mexico can do this better than the United States, is call it what it is. It's terrorism, and they'll jump through hoops to try and deflect from it because, and I want to jump back again to the point you made, Cenk, which was great, to look at the further scale of this. I mean, whenever there's an act of terror committed by a Muslim extremist, they're ravaging through their cousin's Facebook from years ago to try and see if there's any ties. What can we connect us to? What are the lines? What about the communities there? I mean, look what happened to the Somali community. I mean, even in the community they looked at in Ilhan Omar's district, they were scrutinizing every single person who potentially had ties to anyone across the globe in the act of terror that they were looking into. Why are we not doing the same thing?
Yeah, and so that's, look, when Muslims do the attack, they immediately look for a network, as Francis just said. But in this case, when the right-wing white supremacists do the attack, there actually is a network. They communicate online, yet we go lone wolf. What do you mean lone wolf? There's communities online that discuss this type of thing. First, they talk about the ideology, it's a Hispanic invasion, etc., or the Muslims are the worst. There was in the middle of the country a couple of white supremacists that were going to blow up a building full of Somali refugees that I actually at this point had become American citizens, etc. And nobody ever says, let's look into their cousins, let's look into who, and to be fair to the FBI, they caught those guys, and so they've done some good police work. But overall in the media, people aren't like, okay, where's the network of right-wing terrorists that we got to take down? Where is the ISIS equivalent? And the reality is, in a sense, there is an ISIS equivalent, and it's online.
Yeah.
And so, look, we live online. I'm not looking to do some sort of weird dragnet of all ideologies online and say if you're a right winger online, you should be investigated. Hell no, right? And I believe in our privacy rights, etc. But if there are specific groups online where they are talking about these type of things, and they're encouraging one another, that's leading to massacres, should we look into that? Of course, that's classic law enforcement 101. And so we should be thinking about it. And I think that our assumptions that are based somewhat on race, et cetera, drive our view of Muslims being all connected when they do something. But when it's white supremacists who do it, not at all connected. And that's not true. And last thing about our assumptions is, I think to the point that Brooke made, if this was an attack, let's say not in Australia, but in China, and a Chinese nationalist was upset about the tariffs and went and specifically drove a long way, as this guy did, went from suburbs of Dallas to El Paso, drove a long way to specifically go murder Americans. I mean, we might literally be up in arms, right? Oh my God, the Chinese are killing Americans in their country now. Oh, we gotta do something. But when it's Mexicans killed in America, it's Tuesday and we move on.
Yeah, you know what's so frustrating is that it is, I think, important to note how these people are somewhat like radicalized, right? But a big part of it is that what happened in El Paso didn't even begin with the current president. It literally is so embedded in like how this country works. People have been killing Black people, Native Americans, Latin Americans since the beginning of this country's existence, just because of it's how this country began.
Yeah.
And we are still not as a whole willing to acknowledge that that is just what we are. That is what this country is. And so how can we even get to the point to where we're gonna do something about and call it what it is, this terrorist, call it terrorism and do something about it. If we're not even willing to just say it, it's racism.
Yeah, well,
when talking about simple things.
I agree with that wholeheartedly, and that goes back to the first point I made, is like everyone wants to go to the immediate, and it's an easy talking point. I mean, definitely they feel emboldened under Donald Trump, but for years, we look back and we trace the FBI, and I know they have been doing great work in order to pursue specific cases like Cenk mentioned there, in finding extremists who happen to be Muslim and stamping that threat out. But for years, it's kind of been overlooked as if there's white extremists, then they can't really be considered a threat. I mean, they're quicker to label Antifa a terrorist group than they are at looking into white nationalists. That tells you everything you have to figure out on how much we as a nation perceive this threat, to the point where we're not putting towards anywhere near enough resources in order to link into it. I mean, how many times do you hear after these shootings happened, there was red flags, or they had some sort of an initial investigation into the family or the person involved, but never thorough enough. I mean, you replace the skin color, I'm sorry to say it, and I'm sure it goes race baiting 101, but if you replace the skin color, and if there's any sense of any threat, they're immediately vetted and looked at as a potential threat. But because it's this idea that they cannot be the same as other groups who happen to be terrorists, that we're not gonna look at it through the lens of, oh, this could be an imminent threat, and you end up missing out.
When you say race baiting, because that's what the right wing says all the time online. Okay, when you point out that he went to go stop the Hispanic invasion and targeted Latinos specifically, when we point that out, which is just a fact, they say race baiting. When he goes to murder Latinos, not race baiting. What? Right? And so I'm tired of arguing with these guys on absolute nonsense that makes no sense. Last thing I'll say is, look, even Obama was intimidated by Fox News and Rush Limbaugh into lowering the number of people working on tracking right-wing extremists in this country, because it's base assumptions for America. How dare you? Okay, we track a left-wing all the time, whether it's civil rights movement, Antifa, environmentalists, that's totally fine. If you go after the beloved right-wing, there will be fury, and we've got to be bold enough, strong enough to say, I don't care, that's like your opinion, man, but I'm going to do my job. I'm going to do real law enforcement, because I'm not going to allow these mass shootings to happen on my watch. And obviously Trump, who said that he alone could protect us, has now had record number of mass shootings on his watch. Well, hey, you made it this far. You must really like the Young Turks. Thank you, we really appreciate you. Now, another easy way to keep supporting us also helps keep your internet activities and data private, all with a push of the NordVPN app. Head to nordvpn.com/TYT right now for 75% off of your next 3 years.